Yeah, as he mentioned, I've been working for the web team at the Church History Department just for a few months. Started in this September, and just before I started, on Artist Partial's Facebook page, I saw the image you see up here. This is covered wagons, which is a very familiar Mormon image, with camels next to them, which is less familiar. And she mentioned the historical event this was from was an exodus of Latter-day Saints in 1921 from the city of Antab to Aleppo. They're fairly close to each other, but today Antab is in Turkey and Aleppo is in Syria. At the time, the border was still shifting. Both had been in the Ottoman. Did you know there were missionaries in the Ottoman Empire? I had no idea. From the 1880s, there were missionaries in the Ottoman Empire. Most of the converts were ethnic Armenian, and as the empire collapsed, Antab ended up in Turkey, Aleppo ended up in French Syria. And so they were going from danger in Turkey to French Syria. Anyway, when I saw the camels, I was sold. And I wanted to know what's the story behind this and how can we tell this story. The main thing I'm interested today is in the history telling. The history is storytelling within our community. So I went and looked, and I found out most of the records about these incidents come from President Joseph Wilford Booth. He's a really incredible missionary, spent 17 years on and off in the mission field, died in Aleppo between the time they decided to release him in Salt Lake and the time word of that release reached him. You know, died not knowing he'd been released as a mission president. In a way, it's kind of sad. In a way, it's sort of fitting for someone who had a strong commitment to the place where he went. And if you look at the records he keeps, you can get a brief outline of events, which I've sort of summarized some of the main events we might hear from President Booth here. So he'd been mission president over this mission until 1909, at which point, because of political turmoil, starting with pogroms against Armenians, he and the missionaries had to leave. He was gone until 21, and in that time the members didn't have any foreign missionaries. In 1921 he was called back to help them in the wake of wartime massacres. Those wartime massacres we now refer to as the Armenian Genocide. That's actually the events the term genocide was coined in response to. At the same time, President Booth was sent back with some fast offering funds from special fasts held for the Armenian saints. He was going across the Atlantic and through Europe to Syria. Elder David O. McKay of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles was going on a worldwide tour that had started through the Pacific, and he went all the way around the world. And they hoped to meet, but both were in places where they didn't have access to telegraphs, etc. There was no way to coordinate. It was, I've gone east, you've gone west, let's hope that in the 1.5 million people in Israel will cross paths. And in fact, they did. At a train station in Haifa, randomly, 2 minutes before Booth went back to his hotel. It made a deep impression on him. He really saw the hand of the Lord in that as he had this challenge of helping saints who were in the threat of continued persecution where they were, he was able to meet up with an apostle and get advice. So after his meeting with David O. McKay, he was able to meet with French authorities and get permission for the saints to, the French actually, they were afraid everyone would leave if they allowed permission to leave. So the French, you had to get an exit visa to get out. He was able to get those exit visas for the saints and bring them to Aleppo. This is the story roughly that you'd find if you went through the documents. And actually there's one 1928 article in the Juvenile Instructor he wrote, about a 4-page article. It's interesting, 1/4 of the article is devoted to this story of meeting with Elder McKay at the Haifa railway station, pictured here. Not at the day they met, but it's the same railroad station. It's very important. All right, let's take a step back. As I was reading this story, there's a lot of it that's very interesting and compelling. And there's one significant problem, which is that it tells us almost nothing about what it was like to be an Armenian member of the church in this situation at that time. And the central thing I want to talk about today is how do you get past a perfectly good and interesting missionary story to a story that really tells us about the global church. And quite frankly, we're not always very good at this, because our archives were primarily created by missionaries. It's easier to keep track of. There's a lot fewer missionaries. Missionaries have to write records, which ordinary members don't. We could go on and on about the reasons, but it's important to note the missionary records are what we have. How do we get past them? So I decided this story was worth telling, and I was going to look for who was a member who came up a lot in the missionary records. And I found this man, Moses Hindoian. There'd just be hints here and there, and I went and collected them. And if you try to tell the same historical event from Moses Hindoian's perspective, this is about the story you get. I'll back up. In 1893, Moses Hindoian, raised in the Armenian Apostolic Church, finds out about a church with 12 living apostles and is amazed and embraces Mormonism. His son is born that same year and raised a member of the church. So the second generation starting in 1893 in this family of Mormonism. During World War I, both father and son are drafted. Moses fought in the Ottoman army. He was taken a prisoner of war by the British in Egypt and preached the gospel in prison in Egypt. After the war, he went home. In a way, that was the best place he could have been during that time. He gets back to his hometown and finds that as his country was losing the war, they lashed out against his ethnic community. The entire branch presidency had been killed, and the members had been scattered, along with many other people who came from the same community they did. So he was a priest at the time. They didn't automatically make you an elder unless you needed to for a calling, sort of like high priest. No, he was just a priest. But he gathered the members and he started writing letters for help to a sister named Esther Plowgian who was living in Utah. She took them to Booth, who took them to Salt Lake, and that's how President Booth came to return in 1921 because of Moses Hindoian's letters. Once Booth arrived in Aleppo, there were some of the saints there. There'd been a branch in Aleppo. Booth couldn't initially get through to Antab because it was a war zone. Hindoian kept sending letters. We have an account that says Booth would read them out loud in Aleppo, and the saints would weep when they heard what was happening to their brothers and sisters there. We also have an account that when Booth went to pick up those visas, Moses Hindoian was with him. Right? We don't know exactly how involved Hindoian was in the process, but he was part of that, organizing and moving people away. And then in Aleppo, we have plenty of accounts about Hindoian. He was ordained an elder and helped really settle people in a new home. His grandson I talked to said, you Americans move around like cats. You don't understand that for someone who lived in that part of the world, moving to another city is a big deal. And that was a major transition that they were able to make. One other thing we can find in the records, he was able to find spouses for his children, which could be difficult as a Mormon, already a minority within a minority. He was able to bless his grandchildren when they were sick. We have great records of that, and really find joy in his posterity. In many ways, it's a wonderful Mormon life. And it's interesting that we have an exodus led by a Moses in 1921 church history. This is a picture of Moses Hindoian later in life with his son Abraham right next to him and his granddaughter Melva, 3 generations, at the grave of Wilford Booth. They were close through their lives, and even after Booth's death, they'd continue to visit his grave and a memorial there. On the other side, we have a grave I found on a blog post that said, there was an LDS American who'd been visiting Syria, went to see Booth's grave, and took pictures of a grave of a local member that was nearby. He had no idea who it was. I don't read Armenian. I had to put it up on Facebook and ask all my Armenian friends. One of them, somebody who doesn't read Armenian, said, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it ends in IAM, which every Armenian last name ends in IAM. Anyway, this is Moses Hindoian's grave. I do think it's interesting, and part of the problem that we need to address, that we have all kinds of documentation about this Booth monument, the monument of another missionary who had died there, which was moved to be next to Booth. There are no images in the church history library I'm aware of Moses Hindoian's grave. And if someone goes there, I mean, right now there's nothing we can do in Syria to correct this, but there's no indication for a non-Armenian reading Latter-day Saint who this is and what he did. This is the problem we have. We don't necessarily do well at telling these member stories. They fall so easily between the cracks. So we made an online exhibit that tried to tell this Exodus story, integrating more of the Hindoian story. We also included other members, actually at Artist Partial's suggestion. We did some hunting around and got multiple moments from Yera Nikadikian's life. You see her on the side. She grew up in the church. There's a great description of her at age 4 as the black-eyed pride of the Antab branch. She was widowed at age 16 when her husband was separated from her and shot just over a hill in the genocide. She came back to Antab. As far as she knew, all her family members had been killed, but Moses Hindoian, she was one of the ones who was gathered up, and she ended up finding a brother in Aleppo. He'd independently escaped there, so she's reunited later. We have a nice story about her. Okay, so that was the story of this Exodus. How can we generalize these lessons and find ways to tell member-centered stories in general? I have a few suggestions. First one, we need to remember that gravity is real. And in our case, it's an archival gravity of the records. I've labeled here Jupiter is like missionary archives. The spot in Jupiter is like interesting stories in missionary archives, right? Those of you who have worked in the archives know that not all of it is interesting. You're doing a lot of sifting already just to get to those fascinating moments. The story you want, this is the size of Earth next to Jupiter. The story you want might show up there, but it's not there. And if you're not very careful, you'll get pulled in to following the story the way it's been told before, which is from the perspective of the person who wrote the records, okay? Here's an example. Easy mission records that, as a church history staff employee, I can pull up to my desk with a click. J.W. Booth's journals. Actually, you could read those online tonight. They're at BYU. Mary Booth's journals, contemporary church magazine articles, mostly written by Booth, sometimes written about Booth. There's a mission history, right? I've got a list on the other side of member records we know or have reason to believe once existed that are lost. Moses Hindoian's letters, we don't have them. Prize essays, they had an essay contest in 1926 to commemorate the 5-year anniversary of their deliverance. And so you had multiple essays by members saying, this is what I remember about when the Lord delivered me from Antab. And we have their local publication not up to that year. We don't have those first-hand accounts. They were written, they kept their history, somehow we've been unable to collect and preserve it, like most documents created by members of the church. Branch records from the war years probably existed and were probably lost. Most oral history is lost. We've collected some years later, but most from the time is lost. So how did we find out what it was like to be one of these? Well, the missionary records have references. I think what's important, Booth wouldn't have seen Moses Hindoian as a hero, he was a friend. And so he doesn't tell his great heroic story, he says, we had yogurt and bread together for dinner tonight, right? But still, if you know to look for the member, often the missionaries do, and we can search electronically now, right? There's ways to go and find references. So we have lots of passing references to Moses Hindoian if someone is willing to connect the dots. We have references in oral histories and later church news articles. All right, second principle, if you're trying to write a member-centered story, remember the power of perspective. I have here a picture of Orson Scott Card, who's probably our best-known Mormon storyteller. His book on writing is called Characters and Viewpoint. He argues that the most important decision if you're writing a book is whose eyes do you show us the events through. Not what happens, not the plots, but the perspective. What did somebody feel and think about that? History and story are not that far apart. History is always told through some viewpoint. If we don't make deliberate choices about which viewpoint we choose, we'll end up with the viewpoint of the people who wrote the records. And it's not necessarily a very global, diverse viewpoint like the stories we want to hear. Sometimes finding your viewpoint can be like doing Where's Waldo, those of you who remember that. For me, it was my childhood when that was popular. Other people may date differently. I do want to point out, though, you don't always need just one member. Sometimes any perspective will do, right? I would love to hear the story of this guy on top of the fountain in our picture. We could choose anyone, but their perspective is what makes it valuable. My third principle when trying to write a member-centered story or tell a member-centered story is to understand the relationship between sort of three kinds of stories, right? One is the member story you're trying to achieve. Another one is the missionary or administrative story about what's changing in the church. This tends to be the story we have the best documents on. It matters, don't tell it directly, but if you understand that story, you can maybe more easily understand the effect that had on the members. The top of the triangle is a historical grand narrative. In this case, it was the Armenian Genocide, right? Now, we don't have many specifics. In fact, we have no firsthand records about the deaths of those branch presidency members, but we know they died during this important historical era. That allows us to tell the story by deferring in a way to other records outside of church history that give us a sense of what that country's history was like at that time. All right, those are my suggestions for an individual writer. I also have two suggestions for specific things we can do sort of as a field of church history storytellers and collectors to get closer to telling good member-driven stories. The first is to add a fourth kind of story. Remember, we've got the member stories, missionary administrative stories, and historical grand narratives, things that happen in history. It would be helpful if we had more church grand narratives. And what I mean by that is overarching stories when somebody thinks about history, what are the broad outlines they can give us? I'll tell you, we've got, well, I've got it on the next slide. The gospel is restored, right? People know if you tell the story from the 1830s or 40s, it's going to tie into our idea that the gospel was restored. The pioneers sacrificed, right? I don't need a lot of details necessarily about an individual who crossed the plains. We supplement that individual understanding with our big story. For most of global Mormonism, our one grand church narrative everybody knows is the church grew. It got bigger. Sometimes it's a useful story, sometimes it's not. Sad story. When we did this Armenian Exodus online exhibit, which you can still read on history.lds.org under Pioneers in Everyland, when we first did it, it was featured on LDS.org. And for the first few hours after it was featured, their tagline was, "See how the church grew in Turkey through miracles and faith." That's not the story we were telling. When the majority, when half of your members are killed, it's not church growth. It's important, but it's not church growth. Why did they do that? Because that is the large church story we automatically bring to an international church story unless, what alternatives did they have, right? Well, they did. After a few hours, they fixed it and made it much more interesting and fitting. I think as a community, we have a lot of work to do to say what are sort of the grand overarching stories about church membership. I'm going to give a few examples. One, if Joseph Dorowski is here, I don't know if I should credit him. He's the one I learned this from. But he taught me to see the early days of the church, not just as the gospel is restored, here's the dates, different things came forth, but an idea that we're becoming saints, including Joseph Smith. People were learning how to take on this new identity. And it changes the way you talk about the early days of the church, right? The perspective you might choose. For the word of wisdom, you might want Zebedee Coltrane's account that says, Joseph comes with the word of wisdom and 9 out of 10 of us smoke. The crisis of revelation is the phrasing I've given to one that Artist Partial's been working with, which is, we have a revelation, say the end of the gathering to Utah. And it's a crisis for church members because it changes so many things, right? If you're not planning to emigrate, where else does that energy go? If you live in a small branch, who are your kids going to marry, right? This model of the crisis of Revelation moving us through church history allows us to tell lots of stories that aren't necessarily just people got baptized, the church got bigger. President Uchtdorf mentioned this. He went to the musical I Am Jane, about Jane Manning James at BYU, and told the writer after the play ended, he just smiled at her, said, "This was wonderful. The restoration continues." I don't know exactly what he means by that, but it sounds wonderful. The idea, I think there's a grand narrative here of ongoing progress within the church, the restoration continuing, which we don't always tell. Sometimes we say, here's the church, it's perfect, and it's getting bigger, or it's doing this. We don't have that big story to tap into. I've got some others. I was thinking about Latin America, right? 40% of the church, at least as far as our roles, is there, and it's hard to tell stories about them sometimes. One that would be a great fit for there is urbanization. Things are changing in their countries, and the search for roots. Okay, you've left your old traditional way of life. You don't really want sort of this shallow modern alternative, and Mormonism speaks to that. Oh, I thought that was a 3-minute warning, not an over. Excuse me. I'll close quickly with one thing I'd just like to say, and that is one more thing we can do for those of you who collect oral history. I think it would be great if we could get 2 local people in an oral history instead of 1. I've researched a lot with the oral histories. I love them. So often the filter of the person asking the questions gets in my way, and it's frustrating. When I talked to 2 grandchildren of Moses Hindoian together, they remind each other of other things. They understand things about their experience that we don't have. This on the right is a picture of my grandfather, who was the first mission president in India. His stories from his mission are wonderful. There's lots of intimate stories about individual members. None of them are in his oral history in the church library, because the questions he were asked were administrative missionary questions, not member-centered questions. This on the left, in the blue turban, is also my grandfather. We talk to that guy. We need someone who knows he's also the other guy, right? If you talk to him and someone from the mission with him, or a relative who knows those individual stories, we could record a lot of things we're missing now. So thank you very much. And I leave you my testimony that church history blesses us because of the effect it made in individual people's lives. And we can capture that if we are willing to go an extra mile and try. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.